Hello everybody, good morning. Today I'm going to be responding to a video by the Inspiring Philosophy YouTube channel. I'm sure most of you already know that Inspiring Philosophy is a Christian apologist. He runs a social media ministry on YouTube and TikTok, although I've never actually seen any of his TikTok videos. His video that I'll be responding to is this one here, and as you can see it's called What Are the Gospels? And in this video, he argues that the Gospels should be classified within the genre of what he calls Greco-Roman biography. Oh, and by the way, I do mostly agree with that. I agree that the Gospels really are ancient biographies, so long as we're careful not to read too much into what that might mean. But anyway, after that, he goes on about how he thinks biography was, quote, a genre which aimed to preserve accurate historical information, unquote. But that, as it turns out, is only sometimes true, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then he also believes that this is relevant to showing that the Gospels don't contain any fictitious or legendary material. As he puts it, the Gospel authors, quote, exceeded the standards of the day for historical accuracy, unquote. So, as you might imagine, these are far, far more controversial claims than just that the Gospels are ancient biographies. And we're going to look at those claims in just a moment. Before we do that, though, let me just emphasize that I agree with Inspiring Philosophy that the Gospels really do appear to take the form of biographies. And that's not to say that they're true. They're not necessarily true stories. In ancient Greek literature, you can find examples of historical novels, which function as fictional biographies. And so, for instance, the classicist Nora Goldschmidt points out that, quote, some of the most popular ancient biographical accounts of historical figures that we know of would have naturally crisscrossed later demarcations between biography and fiction, unquote. And then she names three such biographies: the Cyropaedia by Xenophon of Athens, the Life of Aesop, that's the famous Aesop from Aesop's Fables, and also the Alexander romance. These are all examples of works of fiction, but fiction in the form of ancient Greek biography. Now, before we go much further, let me be clear up front that I am not saying the Gospels are novels. They're not completely fictional, in other words. But it does look like the Gospels mix fact and fiction. That's how the New Testament scholar Eve Marie Becker puts it. But whatever we want to say about the Gospels' historical reliability, it does seem to be the prevailing view right now that the Gospels are, in some sense, biographies. The big question, though, is in what sense? After all, ancient biography is an extremely broad genre, as classicists like Christopher Pelling here have pointed out. It's so broad, he says, that it may be misleading to count it as a single genre at all, rather than a range of texts linked only in that they do whatever they do through the filter of a person's life. So what is it then that the Gospels are doing? In what sense, in other words, are they to be understood as biographies? The retired historian Loveday Alexander explains this problem as follows, quote, if the Gospels belong to the genre of biography, what kind of biographies are they? Genre on its own isn't enough. We need to probe more deeply into questions of subject matter and mode of discourse if we're to understand the literary structure of these narratives and their impact on contemporary audiences, unquote. Unfortunately, this seems to be an open question, and different scholars have different views on how to proceed. Just to give one example, the New Testament scholar Robin Faith Walsh, she distinguishes the civic tradition of biography that focuses on powerful and respected individuals from what she calls subversive biography, which, in her words, gives voice to those who are on the margins of power and more or less subtly undermine or challenge conventional ideology. And so she goes on to list the fictional Alexander romance and the Life of Aesop as examples of other subversive biographies which she believes can be seen as pertaining to the same biographical tradition. Now, I'm not saying that Robin Faith Walsh is correct about all that. Maybe she is, maybe she isn't. But the point is, viewing the Gospels as ancient biographies doesn't actually tell us a whole lot about what the Gospel authors were trying to do. Inspiring Philosophy, though, doesn't seem to accept that. He claims that, quote, the very act of writing biographies indicates that the gospel authors were interested in providing historical accounts of what Jesus said and did, not crafting tales of Jesus from unreliable hearsay, unquote. But this isn't the standard view of professional scholars. Hendrika Roscom, for instance, she's a Greek and Latin lecturer at University of Groningen. She writes, quote, the characterization of Mark's gospel as an ancient biography does not yield any clear information about the evangelist's purpose in writing, unquote. And then there's also Christopher Tuckett. He's a retired University of Oxford professor, and he adds, quote, such a categorization does not determine precisely how the Gospels can or should be read. Certainly the category of biography does not necessarily imply historical veracity, unquote. Now, I've already mentioned a few minutes ago some examples of biographies that are outright fictional. But even for ancient biographies that are more or less historical, that doesn't mean that they're free of legendary material or other embellishments. If anything, the genre of biography may have been more susceptible to fictionalization than some other forms of ancient historiography, and this is what the retired New Testament professor Andrew Lincoln is talking about here when he says that, quote, in ancient biography there was even less of a distinction between what we would call factual and fictional elements. And this is also what the classicist Cohen de Temmerman had in mind when he argued that, quote, ancient biography is generally not concerned with sustained historical veracity. On the contrary, modes of emplotment and conventional structures of fiction are operative in it and make it a creative and meaningful literary form rather than simply a recorder of historical fact, unquote. And I'll give you an example of what he's talking about. Let me read to you a very short excerpt. It's not very long, I promise. It's from Suetonius's biography of the Roman Emperor Caligula. Now, I should probably give some background. Caligula was assassinated in the year AD 41, and Suetonius is writing about the lead-up to that assassination. Here's what he says, quote, his approaching murder was foretold by many prodigies. The statue of Jupiter at Olympia, which he had ordered to be taken to pieces and moved to Rome, suddenly uttered such a peal of laughter that the scaffoldings collapsed and the workmen took to their heels. The Capitol at Capua was struck by lightning on the Ides of March, and also the room of the doorkeeper of the palace at Rome. The soothsayer, too, when Gaius consulted him about his horoscope, Gaius is another name for the Emperor Caligula, the soothsayer declared that inevitable death was close at hand. The lots of fortune at Antium warned him to beware of Cassius, and it just keeps going on like that. Suetonius is listing a bunch of supernatural omens that supposedly happened leading up to the assassination of Caligula. Now, I don't know any historians nowadays who would believe Suetonius' story that an inanimate statue of Jupiter decided to laugh at Caligula, or that soothsayers had some kind of psychic foreknowledge of his murder, or anything like that. What seems to have happened is that either Suetonius was maybe just lying, making stuff up, or maybe more likely he was passing on dubious anecdotes that he had heard from others. And so the classicist Richard Saller, he explains this phenomenon as follows, quote, many anecdotes were included in the biographies of emperors, most notably by Suetonius and in the Historia Augusta. Frequently originating from gossip, anecdotes provided just the sort of material biographers required, whereas dignified historians proclaimed that petty anecdotes were not worthy of history. Suetonius delighted in regaling his readers with sometimes incredible stories, hardly ever expressing a hint of skepticism. Accuracy of content and reliability of sources were not matters of concern for the biographer, unquote. And it seems like we're in a similar situation with the Gospels, especially the Gospel of Mark. Helen Bond, she's a New Testament historian at University of Edinburgh. Helen Bond points out that, quote, within Mark's narrative, the anecdote is supreme. The work is largely a patchwork of short episodes, stories, sayings, and dialogues, unquote. The question is, where is Mark getting these stories? Are these stories that he's heard through some kind of oral tradition? Does he have some kind of Aramaic source texts that he's translating into Greek? Is he maybe even inventing some of these stories, just making them up whole cloth? That is what some historians like James Crossley think. James Crossley makes the following argument, quote, as early Jewish and Greco-Roman literature amply shows, people were more than happy to make up stories about rulers, rabbis, holy men, great biblical figures, etc., and did so as they saw fit. There is plenty of evidence that the first Christians were immersed in the world of creative storytelling that had minimal grounding in history. Such creative retelling was so common and so accepted a part of the cultural climate that it would be highly unlikely that the Gospels did not indulge in it. The Gospels do, after all, talk about their own Jewish hero, Jesus. Passages that might be judged to be creative rewriting might include stories of a dead man coming back to life and walking around and eating with people, unquote. And then he also goes on to cite Matthew 27:52-53. That's where a bunch of saints' bodies get reanimated and walk around Jerusalem. Crossley cites that story as another example for which the blindingly obvious conclusion, as he puts it, is that it is a piece of fiction. Now, Crossley was talking about Luke and Matthew in those two examples that we just saw, but there are also examples where it looks like Mark may have invented a story. Hendrika Roscom, for instance, she's that scholar from University of Groningen. She apparently thinks that Mark may have made up the story of the women discovering Jesus's empty tomb. She writes, quote, it is likely that the story in Mark 16 is not much older than Mark, if not an invention of the evangelist himself, unquote. Now, not all scholars are quite as pessimistic as Crossley and Roscom. Some scholars will hypothesize that Mark didn't make up any stories himself. They think maybe he only reworked pre-existing traditions. And, that's fine. Scholars can hypothesize all they want. But at the end of the day, as the biblical historian Craig Evans reminds us, we don't know Mark's sources. And so I'm not saying that Mark definitely made stuff up. Maybe he did, or maybe he didn't. Unfortunately, there's no way to tell which bits were invented by Mark himself and which bits he may have inherited from some pre-existing tradition or legend. And for instance, this is exactly what the biblical scholar Arthur Bellinzoni is talking about when he laments that, quote, distinguishing between legends and constructions of the evangelist is particularly difficult and in some instances virtually impossible, unquote. Now, my own view is that clearly some people in the early church were making stuff up. And so for all we know, it might as well have been Mark himself doing some of that inventing of fictional stories. Inspiring Philosophy, though, he isn't having any of this. And it's a little strange because at times he does seem to acknowledge that Ancient Biography could contain fictive elements, but he apparently thinks that there was a limit to how far a biographer would push that line. And in particular, he insists that, quote, historians could not invent stories, unquote. And then to support this claim, he references the classicists Martin de Porc and Geert Roscom, and I'm so sorry, I know I must be mispronouncing those, but he references those classicists as saying that Plutarch didn't do that. Plutarch never invented entire stories whole cloth. And I guess the inference he wants to make is that since Plutarch didn't do it, therefore the gospel authors didn't invent stories either. But de Porc and Roscom also point out, and by the way, this is in the very same article that Inspiring Philosophy referenced in his video, they also point out that their conclusions are only valid for Plutarch. And this is what they write. And again, this is the same reference that Inspiring Philosophy gives in his video, just a different place in the article. Quote, within the genre of biography, authorial strategies and approaches greatly differed. This has important methodological consequences in that it allows for general conclusions only after careful case studies of each particular biographer, unquote. In other words, yeah, Plutarch may have reined in his creative impulses, but that tells us nothing about what, say, Philostratus did. Philostratus was another ancient Greek biographer who wrote a life of Apollonius. In fact, the Greco-Roman historian Nathaniel Andrada notes that, quote, its treatment of Apollonius largely consisted of invented tradition and the author's imagination, unquote. So are the gospel authors more like Plutarch? That's what the New Testament scholar Michael Licona thinks, for example. Or are they more like the life of Apollonius? That's what the late biblical Greek expert Clyde Votaw thought. Maybe it's just impossible to find a literary parallel among the extant ancient biographies that's close in time to the Gospels. That's what Hendrika Roscom thinks, and in fact, I also lean in that direction myself. I don't think any of the Gospels are very much like any particular biography from the ancient world. But other scholars, they're going to make their own different suggestions, and that's what I meant before when I said that this is an open question. Now, Inspiring Philosophy is entirely correct. I agree with him when he points out that there's, I don't want to say a consensus, there's something like a consensus that the Gospels are ancient biographies. And, that's fine, but scholars disagree about how to narrow down that very broad genre to try and figure out what kind of ancient biographies the Gospels are. And so, for instance, summarizing Ernst Renan, the late Charles Talbert puts it like this, quote, it is assumed that the Gospels are biographies. What is at stake is the matter of where among the various types of biographies of antiquity they belong. That is, how reliable they are historically, unquote. In other words, saying that the Gospels are ancient biographies, that's all well and good, but that doesn't really help us figure out whether the stories that they're telling are true. So I think that mostly covers what Inspiring Philosophy was arguing in his video, but there is one last argument that he makes that I wanted to address. He says, quote, we have some fictional biographies from the ancient world, but none were written within living memory of the eyewitnesses, unquote. Now, there is some truth to this insofar as all the examples that I've given, up to now anyway, of fictionalized biographies come from, at least a century after the subject lived. So, for instance, the 1st century AD Pythagorean philosopher Apollonius of Tyana, he's the subject of the heavily fictionalized biography written in the 3rd century, which I mentioned earlier. That's Philostratus's Life of Apollonius. And those dates are just estimates, but it gives us a gap of a little over 100 years between when the subject died and when the author wrote. But the Gospels are probably not written that long after Jesus died. For example, the prevailing view among scholars right now is to date the Gospel of Mark in the period between the years 65 and 75. And yeah, I know that there are scholars who disagree, some place it earlier, some place it later, but at least on this standard view of Mark being written around AD 70, that might not even be 40 years after Jesus' crucifixion. That's still a long time, but it is at least within living memory. In other words, when Mark was writing, people who had walked and talked with the historical Jesus were probably still alive. But this doesn't mean that Mark's gospel is historical. It doesn't even mean that Mark was trying to write accurate history. He may have been, or maybe not. We just don't know. And I think a bit of common sense can tell us that people are perfectly capable of making up fictional stories about other people when they're alive, to say nothing about after they've died. And we don't have to just rely on common sense, although really common sense should be quite sufficient. But we don't have to rely on just that. We have several examples from antiquity that disprove the idea that living memory is somehow enough to safeguard historical accuracy. And this is what the New Testament historian Dale Allison is talking about when he gives 2 such examples. Quote, legends do not courteously wait to arrive until their protagonists are long dead and gone. Fables about Alexander the Great circulated from the beginning. The Syriac life of Simeon Stylites was composed within 14 years of Simeon's death by a monk or monks living where Simeon lived, and yet it often stretches credulity, unquote. But these actually aren't my favorite examples. My favorite example is Sulpicius Severus's Life of Martin of Tours. And according to the classicist John Higgins, quote, "In the life of Martin, we have a very Christian interpretation of ancient biography in a late imperial context," unquote. Now, St. Martin was apparently some kind of an ascetic who served as bishop in modern-day France. And I wanted to give you a little thumbnail sketch of his life that the historians Thomas Noble and Thomas Head gave. It's pretty interesting. So here it is. Quote, "Martin was born circa 336 in Roman Pannonia, modern Hungary. He entered the army but soon regretted having done so. He longed for a life of Christian withdrawal and finally received permission from his superiors to leave the forces. Then, in a fairly traditional pattern, he experienced individual asceticism, learned from spiritual masters, and wound up as a master to others. Martin became Bishop of Tours circa 372 and was regarded as something of an oddball by the cultured, elegant bishops of late antique Gaul. Undaunted, Martin carried on with his ascetic ways. He died in 397, unquote. And as it turns out, Sulpicius Severus, he's Martin's biographer, Severus actually interviewed Martin personally in preparation for writing his biography. The late John McCullough, he was a historian at Kansas State University, McCullough lays out the background as follows, quote, "Sulpicius Severus was born around 360 in Aquitaine, the southwest of modern France. Through a personal contact, he learned about Martin and decided to write an account of the holy bishop's life. He traveled to Tours to talk to and observe his subject, and he supplemented his personal investigations with literary material borrowed from various sources, including Athanasius's Life of Antony. Sulpicius finished his work and began to circulate it shortly before Martin died in 397, unquote." So everything looks good so far. Severus is able to personally interview Martin, and he even publishes his biography during Martin's own lifetime. So according to Inspiring Philosophy, there shouldn't be any problem. We've got an ancient biography of St. Martin written and published not just within living memory, but while St. Martin was still alive. So there shouldn't be any fiction in this biography, right? Well, we can have a look. Here's a little anecdote about Martin that Severus included in his biography. It's in chapter 21, and it starts out by saying that Martin used to have conversations with angels, apparently on a regular basis. And then we go on to read that it's not just angels, the devil used to appear periodically to Martin, and it says that the devil liked to shapeshift somehow. The text isn't clear what it means by this. And then we're told that one day Martin was sitting in his room at whatever monastery he lived at. Martin is just minding his own business when, and I'm not making this up, well, I'm not making it up, the devil suddenly bursts into Martin's room with a tremendous clatter, we're told, and the devil is holding this bloody ox horn, and his right hand is also covered in blood, and so the devil shoves this bloody ox horn into Martin's face, and he starts taunting him. "Martin," he said gleefully, "where is your power? I've just killed one of your people." So, yeah, the devil tells Martin that he's just killed someone. Martin assumes it's probably one of the other monks at the monastery, and so he calls out all these monks, and he tells everybody to go around from room to room in this monastery to see if they can find who it is that the devil killed with this ox horn. And it turns out that all the monks are okay, and they decide maybe it's this peasant that they had hired to drive a wood cart out in the forest. Maybe the devil killed this peasant worker. And sure enough, that's what has happened. They go find this hired peasant worker who is sprawled out by the cart, and they can see there are a bunch of oxen attached to the cart. And he's actually not dead yet, so he's able to tell them what happened. And apparently he was messing around with the cart, and one of the oxen gored him in the groin, we're told. And as he's telling them this, he finally dies in front of them, and that's it. That's the end of the story. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I'm not sure I believe that story. I think some of that might be made up. But according to Inspiring Philosophy, well, it's an ancient biography written within living memory, written within the lifetime of the subject of the biography. So it should be historically accurate on Inspiring Philosophy's view. Severus wouldn't have made that up. He interviewed Martin. He would know. But I just don't think that's a very realistic approach. I don't think that story actually happened. And if there is some kernel of truth to it, and maybe there is, but if there is, then that's lost behind the obviously fictional framing of the story. But anyway, I think that's where I'd like to end this video. To sum up, yes, the Gospels are ancient biographies, but no, that doesn't mean they're historically accurate, or even anything approaching historically accurate. But yeah, I think that's all I've got for you guys today. As always, I really enjoyed doing the research for this video. And if you guys want to comment, I always look forward to the comments that you guys might have. But yeah, until next time, everybody, you all have a great day.